12th century Gaelic society was culturally strong, but politically disunited by the feuding that still persisted between petty kings. The Normans, who had already conquered Britain, soon began to exploit this. Their first opportunity came when the King of Leinster, Dermot MacMurrough Kavanagh, based here at Ferns Abbey, stole the wife of another petty king, Tiernan O'Rourke of Breffni. In retaliation, Tiernan forced Dermot out of his headquarters in 1166. Seeking to rebuild his power base, Dermot sought allies among the Norman lords in Britain. It was here, at Bannow Bay, County Wexford, that, following an initial defeat by Tiernan in 1167, Dermot landed 2 years later with a small army provided by Richard Fitzgilbert, Earl of Pembroke. Pembroke, or Strongbow as he was known, gave his backing in return for the right to marry Dermot's daughter, Aoife, and in time succeed to the kingship of Leinster. And it was here, on the rock of Dunamace, southeast of Kildare, that he built his castle following the marriage. Hence it was by invitation that the Normans gained this first toehold in Ireland. Fortified castles continued to express the authority of the Norman lords as they developed a mighty power base. The largest and best preserved Norman castle in Ireland is that at Carrickfergus in Antrim. Dominating this pleasant seaside town on the north shore of Belfast Lough, it was built by the Anglo-Norman John de Courcy, and work started in 1177, soon after the arrival of the Normans. Norman castles began to occupy strategic positions all over Ireland, and nowhere more so than here in Kilkenny, which is dominated by its cathedral on one side and the castle that faces it on the other side of the city. Strategically located on the banks of the River Nore, Kilkenny soon became a major venue for Anglo-Irish parliaments and a centre for trade. Today it is still Ireland's finest example of a medieval city, with a wealth of historic buildings. It was from castles like that at Kilkenny that Norman families gradually built their power bases. Kilkenny Castle was the main seat of the Butler family, who lived here from the 14th century right through to 1935. The first butler was Theobald Fitzwalter, who came from Caen in Normandy, and was appointed Chief Butler of Ireland in 1177. As with other influential Norman families, the power that the Butlers acquired over Kilkenny was carefully cultivated over the 3 centuries following their arrival in Ireland. They arranged their marriages astutely, ensuring that they were represented on all sides of Ireland's political and religious struggles. Such intermarrying between the Norman Irish and the native Irish brought a gradual integration and growing independence from the English crown. As a result, at a parliament here in Kilkenny, on the very doorstep of the Butler family, the Statutes of Kilkenny were passed in 1366, with the aim of preventing Anglo-Normans from intermingling with the native Irish. However, the process had already gone too far for the new laws to be workable, and the barons continued to thrive as English influence shrank to an area around Dublin known as the Pale. Here in the middle of Ireland lie the counties of Laois and Offaly, whose names give a clue to what happened next. Laois stands for Queen's County, and Offaly means King's County. The king in question was himself related to the Butlers through his marriage to Anne Boleyn, granddaughter of Thomas Butler. Henry VIII, resolving to finally break the nobles' power, proclaimed himself King of this land of Ireland, as united, annexed and knit forever to the imperial crown of the realm of England. His plan for the nobles to surrender their lands to him and have them re-granted by the grace of the king failed when many simply refused. So he seized them anyway, and instead of re-granting them, instigated the first in a succession of planned colonizations by settling them with loyal planters from England. The story of Silken Thomas, still recalled here in Kildare, illustrates the precarious position in which many Irish nobles found themselves. Garret Fitzgerald, the 16th century Earl of Kildare and head of one of the two great branches of the Geraldine family, was obliged to make many visits to England to defend himself against charges of disloyalty, contrived by his Irish enemies. One such visit saw him imprisoned in the Tower of London, accused of being slow to arrest his kinsman, the Earl of Desmond, an alleged enemy of the king. Fitzgerald's son Thomas, known as Silken Thomas after the richness of his clothes and his fondness for silken banners, was barely 21 as he assumed authority in his father's absence. Swamped by rumours that the Earl had been beheaded, he declared, "I am no longer Henry Tudor's deputy, I am his foe." By the time the claims about the Earl's fate were found to be just one more plot to ruin the Geraldine family, it was too late for Thomas to retract his position. Silken Thomas himself was beheaded, and his father died in 1534 in his dungeon, one more victim of the power struggles that were taking place, not just with the king, but also within the Irish nobility itself.
The lady is going to kiss the bloody stone.
You dropped many down there?
Did you do it? Did you do it? Yay!
Well, we did it. Well, I'm telling you.
And finally relinquish your things.
That's right, bro. We've been there. Done it.
Every year, countless numbers come here to Blarney Castle, with just one thought in mind: to kiss the Blarney Stone. The legend is that those who do so will acquire the gift of eloquence.
Okay. Thank you.
As they wander through the fairy glens surrounding the castle, many may be unaware that Blarney is itself steeped in the battle to control Ireland in the 15th and 16th centuries. When the English crown passed to Henry VIII's daughter, Elizabeth I, the Queen ordered the Earl of Leicester to seize the castle from the rebellious MacCarthy clan, who had built it in 1446. It is said that the Earl made numerous eloquent progress reports that actually said very little, prompting an outburst from the Queen that this is all Blarney. True or not, the popular appeal of kissing the stone is as resistant to challenge as the MacCarthys were. For on this occasion, the Queen's efforts to remove them were frustrated. The Kerry town of Tralee is perhaps best known for the festival held every August, at which any girl of Irish descent can compete for the title Rose of Tralee. But it had a key role in Elizabeth I's struggles with the nobles. The town owes its origins to the other half of the Geraldine family that gave rise to the Silken Thomas episode. For it was on this site in 1243 that John Fitzgerald built an abbey. Tralee went on to become the principal seat of his descendants, who in 1355 received the title Earls of Desmond. Unlike the Earl of Kildare, who paid such a high price for his dealings with the crown, the Fitzgerald branch of the Geraldines were more outspoken, and in 1579 they challenged Elizabeth's authority in what became known as the Desmond Rebellion. The Queen severely crushed her opponents, and, as had been the case in the past, confiscated and colonized the rebel land. The beneficiary of all this was a man after whom one of Tralee's handsome 18th century streets is named, Sir Henry Denny. The lands on which the town is built, having been taken away from the Desmonds, were granted to Denny in recognition of his service to the English crown in the massacre of 1580, in which the 15th Earl of Desmond was killed. The Dennys retained control of Tralee for the next 300 years. Step by step, the English crown was increasing its hold over Ireland. Ballinafad Castle, built in 1590 to protect the Curlews mountain pass, is one of the many monuments to this. Only 9 years after its construction, the forces of Hugh Roe O'Donnell defeated the English in what became known as the Battle of the Curlews. But as the sun set on the mountains, it was also drawing an era to an end, for this was to be the last Irish victory in the Elizabethan campaign. Overlooking the broad estuary of the River Bandon, Kinsale is now better known for tourism, yachting and deep-sea fishing. Its winter population of around 2,000 people is swelled each summer by the many thousands who come to explore its small, winding streets. The Kinsale area's location on Ireland's southern coast means that proximity to Europe has been a major influence over the centuries. This is reflected in the magnificent Georgian houses and the Dutch character of much of its architecture. Another significant building is Desmond Castle. It was built in the 16th century as a residence for the Earls of Desmond, but for a brief time in 1601 it was occupied by the Spanish, who used it as a store for ammunition. That the Spanish should show any interest in Kinsale helps explain why Elizabeth I fought so strongly to control Ireland. Although partly motivated by a desire to impose the Reformation, she was also concerned to prevent Spain, England's largest enemy at the time, from using Ireland as a base from which to attack. Great rivalry existed between England and Spain. The issue was who would dominate the seas, but the prize was the ability to found new colonies. Also, in the light of the Reformation, England was now broadly identified with the Protestant cause, whilst Spain represented Catholicism. The Irish nobles were adept at exploiting these differences to further their own cause, and it is in this context that a Spanish force arrived here in Kinsale in 1601. An allegiance with Spain had been formed by a particularly powerful baron, Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, who claimed to be fighting for the Catholic cause in Ireland. O'Neill was based in the north of Ireland and had requested a Spanish landing closer to his power base. The motives of the Spanish leader, Don Juan de Aguirre, in landing over 3,000 troops this far south are unclear. But when they arrived, they found the townspeople, although loyal to the English, willing to cooperate with them. The Spanish forces controlled Kinsale town for 100 days before the English armies arrived under the command of Lord Mountjoy and began to win back strategic positions, including the harbour. Realizing the Spanish were under siege, Hugh O'Neill and his ally Hugh O'Donnell led their armies on a remarkable march across the length of Ireland in order to support the Spanish. It was here, just outside the town at Millwater, that a fierce battle took place between the 5,000 Irish troops and around 3,000 English. The balance of the English army was used to maintain the siege against the Spanish, ensuring they would take no part in the fighting. The Battle of Kinsale lasted just 3 hours and cost over 1,000 Irish lives. The English suffered relatively few casualties and offered the Spanish an honourable surrender and safe conduct home, which they had little choice but to accept. For the Irish, the consequences were much worse. In what has become known as the Flight of the Earls, O'Donnell went to Spain for help, but died there. With no support from home or abroad, O'Neill surrendered in 1603, the day before Queen Elizabeth died. O'Neill's defeat signalled the end of the old Gaelic order. The system of kingship, family ties and customs that had been handed down from the days of Tara was now gone forever. Evidence of the tightening English hold on Ireland can be found in Kinsale itself. Built soon after the battle to strengthen the town's defences, James Fort takes its name from James I, who had by then acceded to the English throne. To complete the defence of the harbour, Charles Fort was built on the other side of the Bandon estuary in around 1677. Although it has undergone many changes since, it is a potent reminder of the long era of English colonial rule that ensued, for it continued to be garrisoned until 1922. It was in the aftermath of the Flight of the Earls that the seeds were sown for a conflict that even today is not totally resolved. Following O'Neill's surrender and subsequent exile, King James I saw the time was right to bring the Gaelic Irish lords into line. By depriving them of their land, he could also remove their power. And so he began a series of plantations, whereby Protestants from England and Scotland were resettled on land confiscated from the Irish aristocrats. The modern Irish Republic comprises only 26 of the 32 counties of Ireland. The remaining 6 counties of Ulster form part of the United Kingdom. The border area between Ulster and the Republic offers little evidence that a border exists at all, and the dividing line has so little contemporary relevance that a man sleeping in his own house may find that his head is in the United Kingdom, whilst his feet are in the Republic. However, there is an historic relevance, for although it was 321 years after the Battle of Kinsale that the partitioning of Ireland took place, the 6 counties of modern Ulster occupy the very lands that were taken from the Gaelic earls. In the wake of the Ulster plantations, the outlook for the Gaelic lords was as desolate as the landscape that characterises Ulster's Sperrin Mountains. But the plantations also devastated peasants, who lost the property rights they had held under ancient Gaelic law. The resentment felt by both classes provoked an obsession with land ownership that would figure prominently in Irish politics for the next 300 years. Mainly to the north of the mountains lies County Londonderry, an area immortalised in the name of the famous Eyre. The song was written in 1851 by Jane Ross, who lived here at Main Street in Limavady. In common with many of the towns in County Londonderry, Limavady owes much to the plantations. for it was refounded by Sir Thomas Phillips, chief agent for the City of London in Ulster. The London livery companies played a major role because most of the confiscated land was parcelled out to them, and they established numerous towns and villages. Sometimes their influence is clear from place names. In other cases, such as the village of Ballykelly, which was created by the Fishmongers' Company, it is the buildings that reflect the livery company's influence. For in establishing places such as this, the livery companies introduced many of the innovative new planning ideas that were current at the time. In the case of Ballykelly, they built a model farm. Today, it serves as a hospital, but the basic design remains unaltered. The church building that stands opposite the farm, although not built until the 19th century, nevertheless reveals another aspect of the plantations. For in addition to those who were officially resettled by the authorities, the new opportunities offered by a new land encouraged the unsponsored migration of working-class Presbyterians from Scotland. This created a potent mix, for it effectively imported the religious conflict between the Anglican and Presbyterian branches of Protestantism that was already underway in Britain. This influx of new population meant that even the non-Gaelic lords, descendants of the Normans who had arrived from England, were no longer secure in their castles. Now known as the Old English, they were not considered completely Irish, nor were they totally accepted by the English establishment. Therefore, they were vulnerable to New English discoverers, whose efforts in finding defects in native Irish land titles resulted in land forfeitures to the Crown. By 1641, Charles I had acceded to the English throne and had become involved in a bitter power struggle with Parliament. Seizing their chance, on the 22nd of October that year, the native Irish rose up in an attempt to regain their lands lost in the plantations. Led by Sir Phelim O'Neill, they quickly gained control of most of central Ulster. Some Gaelic leaders, such as Owen Roe O'Neill, returned from exile on the continent to take part as the rising spread throughout Ireland. Phelim O'Neill claimed that he was simply supporting the king in his struggle with Parliament, which pressured the Old English, with their royalist leanings, to join the Gaelic forces in an uneasy alliance. As the rebellion broadened, so did its aims, as it grew into a defense of Catholicism in general. The execution of Charles I in 1649 left no doubt about how things were moving in England. Parliament's army, led by the Protestant Oliver Cromwell, had emerged victorious from the power struggle there. For the Catholics still rebelling in Ireland, the consequences were catastrophic. Nowhere was this more clearly felt than here in Drogheda. Its strategic importance is based on its position as a gateway town, facing the English mainland on one side and guarding the estuary of the River Boyne on the other. It is on the steep north bank of this historic river that the town centre is built on several levels. And it was here that in 1649, following the abolition of the monarchy and the execution of the king, that Cromwell's army embarked upon a massacre, where it slaughtered 2,000 of the town's garrison and inhabitants. The Irish Catholics were made to pay the price for their years of revolt, as the new Puritan Parliament decreed the absolute suppression of Catholicism in Ireland. What happened here in Drogheda was but one chapter in a lengthy saga of events that saw Ireland devastated by Cromwell's 20,000-strong army. By 1652, about a third of the Catholic Irish had been killed, and much of their land handed over to Protestants. When Charles II came to power following the eventual restoration of the English monarchy, Irish Catholics were at first hopeful, and indeed some of their lands were returned to them. But there was little fundamental change, since the new king depended on the Protestants for his power. It was Charles' successor, James II, who brought the Catholics real cause for optimism, for he was himself a Catholic. He raised hopes by introducing an Act of Parliament intended to oust the Protestant settlers. But the English establishment, alarmed at what they saw as James' popish ways, turned to William of Orange. James was forced into exile, but his Catholic army in Ireland remained intact. In an effort to regain his throne, James promptly began recruiting new Irish and French troops, shrewdly exploiting Irish resentment over land, promising that if his war were successful, they would recover their lands and power. The events that followed had an impact on one place in particular that still resonates today. Derry, or Londonderry as it came to be called, originally developed in the 12th century. It grew up alongside a monastery founded by St. Columcille, in an oak grove alongside the River Foyle. Indeed, its name derives from the Irish word dara, meaning oak grove. The original town was destroyed by fire in 1608, when a local chieftain, Caer O'Doherty, led a rebellion against the mayor. This left the way open for it to be completely redesigned as part of the Ulster plantations. The history of Derry is imaginatively and even-handedly presented at the city's Tower Museum, where great care has been taken to encompass all traditions.
Derry has always had a strategic importance for the control of the northwest of Ulster in general, and as such it was deemed extremely important as part of the plantation scheme to make sure that that area was secured. Therefore, a scheme was drawn up to build a new city or fortified area in the region. The city itself was revolutionary in the sense it was the first piece of urban design or planned urban design in Ireland, and the model or template that was used for it was transported later to the Americas, Philadelphia being a good example of that. In essence, the whole idea was to ensure the control of Ulster was not lost again after the previous experiences and the length that the Elizabethans went to secure it.
The determination of the English to ensure the security of Derry is reflected in the 20 feet thick city walls, which were built between 1613 and 1618.
The plantation was a hugely expensive scheme, and if you want the creation of a new city, it was obviously going to add more to that. The merchant companies in London were given the authority to build the city, and it was their contribution, both financial and in resources, that created the development of this modern 17th century city. Consequently, the town of Derry was given a charter as a city in 1613 and renamed Londonderry, and the prefix was simply in deference or respect to the contribution made by the London companies.
To the Protestant English establishment of the 1600s, the new city of Londonderry was the jewel in the crown of the Ulster plantations, and the original street layout survives virtually unchanged to the present day. At the heart of the walled city is an area called the Diamond. At the time when the new city was built, this term was widely used in this region of Ulster to describe the open central space of a settlement. The planning ideals of the 17th century are clearly visible here, for when standing in the Diamond, all four gates in the walls can be seen at the ends of the streets leading off the square. The plantation origins of the new city are evident through St. Colum's Cathedral. Constructed between 1628 and 1633, this was the first Protestant cathedral built in the British Isles after the Reformation. It is undoubtedly one of the most important 17th century buildings in the country, but interestingly, does not reflect the balance of Derry's population at the time of its construction. In the mid-1630s, Anglican English settlers here were outnumbered 20-1 by settlers from Scotland, who were mainly Presbyterian. This fine church, therefore, reflected the religious persuasions of the city's leading figures of the time, rather than the beliefs of the ordinary citizens. Initially, the economic expansion of Londonderry was quite slow. By the 1680s, there were still only about 2,000 inhabitants, although this was sufficient to make it by far the largest town in Ulster. And it was here that the exiled King James' efforts to regain his throne led to an episode that would resound for centuries to come. In 1688, a garrison of the Irish and French troops recruited by James was sent to take over this plantation city. The governor of Derry at the time, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Lundy, favoured capitulation. He recommended that 2 English regiments and key officers leave the city in order to appease the enemy. But instead of appeasement, there was resistance, the nature of which is alluded to by the name of this building, the Apprentice Boys' Hall. A group of the Protestant apprentice boys of Londonderry feared that the approaching Catholic troops were about to slaughter the local population. Therefore, in December 1688, as James' regiment approached, 13 apprentices arrived here at the Ferry Quay gate and slammed it shut in the face of the arriving soldiers. This act of defiance was exacerbated when the Protestant inhabitants of the city and the thousands of Protestants who had fled here for refuge declared their support for William of Orange. On April the 18th, 1689, James himself came to the city with a 20,000-strong army and demanded its surrender. And so began the siege of Londonderry, which was to last for 105 days. In May, James' supporters constructed a floating barricade across the River Foyle, keeping supply ships at bay for 7 weeks. But this city of walls and watchtowers was designed to be impenetrable, and, as the cannons that still sit astride its fortifications amply demonstrate, was well armed. Cannonballs rained down from both directions, and starvation and disease spread. By the 10th of July, the siege was still continuing, and James' men fired a shell into the city bearing the terms for surrender. It was from here, at the Royal Bastion, that there came a response that has echoed through the history of Ulster ever since. No surrender. About 2 weeks later, the Mountjoy and other ships arrived to relieve the city, smashing through the boom that lay across the river. The army of King James retreated, and the siege was finally over. At the start of the siege, 30,000 had stood defiant within the city's walls. When it ended 15 weeks later, on the 28th of July, 1689, around 7,000 of them had starved to death. Those who survived the siege were in no mood to forgive Governor Lundy, who had secretly escaped in disguise. To this day, he is branded a traitor, as Ulster Protestants burn his effigy each year. The very mortar shell that was fired into the city containing the terms for surrender now stands in the porch of St. Colum's Cathedral. It is a vivid reminder of the lasting impact the siege has had on this city. One that continues to be felt even in the present day. Despite his retreat from Londonderry, James had far from given up the struggle against William of Orange. But the next encounter would prove a turning point. On a steep hill above a bridge across this river stands the beautiful old village of Slane. On the outskirts of this picturesque place is the Hill of Slane, where St. Patrick proclaimed Christianity in Ireland by lighting a paschal fire in the year 433. It is doubtful that St. Patrick could have foreseen how, just a few miles from where it was proclaimed, centuries later, so much blood would be shed in the name of that very religion. For, in the year following the siege of Londonderry, it was across these waters that James II came face to face with William of Orange at the Battle of the Boyne. William landed in Ireland in June 1690, after his troops had already secured Ulster and spent the winter reinforcing. As William led his men towards Dublin, James's army withdrew to the south bank of the Boyne. As battle commenced at this place on the Boyne on the 1st of July of that year, William's army of 36,000 was already 10,000 the stronger. Its numerical superiority increased as William's tactics forced James to divert troops from the main arena. By mid-afternoon, the Jacobites were in retreat, with James himself riding to Dublin to warn of William's approach. Defeat at the Battle of the Boyne saw James immediately flee back to France, effectively abandoning his claim to the throne. The final Irish surrender came in 1691, after the siege of Limerick. At the heart of the events that resulted was that recurring Irish preoccupation: land. With William anxious to deploy his troops in the war against France, the Treaty of Limerick was surprisingly generous to the defeated Catholics. But the various concessions were omitted from the formal document presented to Parliament. Instead, penal laws were introduced, ensuring that Catholics would become a persecuted majority in Ireland. They were barred from public life and not allowed to buy or profitably rent land. When a Catholic landowner died, instead of going to his eldest son, his land was divided between all his sons, unless one turned Protestant, in which case he got it all. This, along with a third and final wave of 17th century plantations, meant that by the mid-18th century, only 7% of land was in Catholic hands. Castletown House in County Kildare, Ireland's first great Palladian mansion, built in 1722, is nothing less than a monument to the increasing disparity in power and wealth that enveloped Ireland. It was commissioned by William Connolly, a lawyer from Ballyshannon. He eventually became known as Speaker Connolly, for in 1692 he became MP for Donegal, and in 1715 was elected Speaker of the Irish House of Commons. The wealth that made it possible for him to indulge in the opulence of this house was acquired through dealing in the Catholic estates that were forfeited through the penal laws that followed the Battle of the Boyne. This aristocratic ruling class enjoyed a party-oriented life on estates such as this, pursued a respectable professional career in law, government, education, or the military, and above all, collected high rents from its Irish tenants. Although often referred to as the Protestant ascendancy, this elite was in fact Anglican-dominated. The Presbyterians who had arrived from Scotland during the plantations distanced themselves from the Anglicans, adhering to their Scottish cultural origins. Congregated in places like Londonderry, close-knit and industrious, they pursued a middle-class existence in business and farming. They became a self-reliant community within a larger society. And this too would have repercussions in future years. Presbyterians played no small part in creating the wealth that Londonderry began to enjoy. The many fine Georgian-style houses that still exist today bear witness to this wealth. Although the numerous prosperous Presbyterian merchants were spared many of the restrictions imposed on Catholics, they were required to tithe to the Anglican Church of Ireland, and were also debarred from holding government office. This proved so demoralizing that large numbers of them went off to start a new life in North America. Much of the prosperity enjoyed by those who remained was brought about by the arrival of the shirt-making industry around 1830. Signs of the commercial wealth that this created here can still be found in the ornamental facades of the shirt-making factories that provided employment for generations. A further expression of this wealth is the Guildhall, erected in 1890. It clearly shows the influence of the London merchants. However, wealth was far from evenly spread, and emigration continued through the 19th century, although by then it was mainly Catholics who were leaving. This in turn gave rise to a new industry, as Derry became one of Ireland's most important embarkation points for emigrants setting out for America. Ironically, it was this latest exodus that helped swell and change the nature of the city's population, because not every would-be emigrant made it past the harbour.
Most of the people, the emigre population who were coming into the city were poor Catholics, and that effectively changed the whole demography of the city. In essence, within a 20-year period, a lot of the industry and trade and businesses in the city changed hands, and the Derry, or Londonderry that we know today, is a nationalist town, owing its roots to those causes, going right back to the siege.
Destined to become a characteristic of Irish life, large-scale emigration began in the 17th century, when up to 100,000 people departed for the North American colonies. By 1776, that number had grown by 4 or 5 times. Despite the overall increase in emigration in the 18th century, the proportion of Catholic emigrants fell to no more than 25%. This is partly because the American colonies were English and Protestant, so little appeared to be gained from leaving. Not that Catholics had much to gain from remaining in Ireland. They were little more than slaves. Despite this, they did not see the English king as their enemy. Indeed, the minority of Catholics who attained gentry status actually supported the king, reaffirming their allegiance to George III when the American colonies declared their independence in 1776. The hatred was reserved for the landlords. It was expressed across the land as violent groups of young men began riding out at night, maiming landlords' cattle and shooting through windows. The life of the ascendancy class in Dublin was far removed from the hardships of the land. But here too there was discontent. St. Patrick's Cathedral was founded by John Comyn in the 12th century, on the site of a holy well, where converts were allegedly once baptized by St. Patrick. After Comyn's death, the church was promoted to a cathedral and replaced by a new building dedicated in 1254. From 1713 to 1745, Jonathan Swift, the author of Gulliver's Travels, was Dean of St. Patrick's. And it was from here that he expressed his anger at the poverty and inequality of Ireland. He urged his countrymen to burn everything English except their coal, and in his satire, A Modest Proposal, he suggested that poor Irish children might be fattened and slaughtered as tasty joints for rich people's tables. But it was another of his proposals that would shortly become a reality. He put forward the notion of a separate Irish Parliament that would still be loyal to the king, but in his role as King of Ireland rather than King of England. Swift's was not an isolated voice. There was a wider feeling that Ireland's economy was being stifled by trade restrictions imposed by Westminster to suit its own interests. Among those pushing for more autonomy was a Protestant group known as the Patriots, who believed a reformed assembly would enhance Irish commerce, as well as preserve Protestant interests. As Ireland's ascendancy class came to regard themselves as Irish rather than British, they reflected the general climate of thought at the time, which was influenced by something going on far from the shores of Ireland: the American Revolution. Aware of an intensifying British nationalism that regarded them as colonial inferiors, the inhabitants of the American colonies were increasingly adopting an identity independent of the mother country. Ireland's ascendancy class saw themselves as sharing a common cause with the Americans. The withdrawal of British troops from Ireland to deal with the rebellions in the American colonies gave those in Ireland who identified with the American Revolution a chance of their own. In 1778, they established their own citizen army. Mainly Protestant and middle class, the Irish Volunteers quickly developed as a paramilitary pressure group. By 1782, they were 80,000 strong, and their influence was crucial in furthering the aims of the Protestant Patriots. It was in that year that the Patriots, led by Henry Grattan, saw their efforts rewarded. London gave way, and this building became home to an independent legislature under allegiance to the king. It became known as Grattan's Parliament, after the Patriot leader. Despite the apparent confidence of the Irish ascendancy class as they boldly assembled in their new parliament, English patronage and influence remained paramount. Infamous as the instruments of this patronage were the so-called Three Jacks: John Foster, Speaker of the Irish Parliament; John Beresford, who became known as the King of Ireland through his control of patronage; and John Fitzgibbon, who was the first Irishman to become Lord Chancellor. Between them, these men effectively managed the Irish Parliament, cynically serving the English interest in Ireland to enhance their own careers. Under such circumstances, the prospect for further reforms and freedoms was at best limited. Exactly how limited would become clear in a mere 20 years' time.